After not seeing Magnus for a whole month, I was really looking forward to at least a simple conversation. But instead, he just pushed a divorce lawyer's business card into my hand. He didn't even bother to ask if I was okay or how I was feeling. He just said, "Divorcing a wife who doesn't work and getting $2,000 a month in alimony sounds good. Take care." And then he left. Greta was standing next to him, wrapping her arm around his like she was showing off, with the same smug look on her face. "Fine, let's get divorced then," I said, trying to sound calm. Magnus seemed a bit surprised at how casually I said it, but he quickly smiled and shared a look with Greta. It's a good thing Magnus isn't much of a deep thinker because that will make my plan easier to carry out. After the divorce papers were finalized, I decided to start planning my revenge on both of them. I was determined to make them regret their actions and cry, which I saw as a way to celebrate my recovery from all this. My name is Freya Wolf, and I'm a 49-year-old illustrator. I also work as a children's book author because I love drawing. I have two childhood friends, Magnus and Greta. They're both very important to me, and Magnus was my husband too. Our story started when Magnus asked me out just as I was about to leave for a different college after high school. I was really surprised because I always thought Magnus was into Greta, but I couldn't say no to his confession. After thinking about it and talking to Greta, I accepted Magnus' proposal. Even though Greta had some problematic behavior since our teenage years, she was still a dear friend to both Magnus and me. Greta had a habit of getting involved with other people's boyfriends and then dumping them once they became obsessed with her, causing trouble again and again. Her parents were worried, so Magnus and I often spent time with her to keep an eye on her. Magnus and I got married when we were 27. For years later, Greta introduced her fiancé to us. His name was Oscar, and he was a professional working for a top company. "Nice to meet you, Freya and Magnus. I've heard a lot about you, and I'm looking forward to our future together," Oscar said. He was very polite, and we all got along right away. We started spending holidays and vacations together, going on trips or taking long train rides to enjoy some drinks. But things began to change after Greta got pregnant 2 years into her marriage. Magnus and I both came from big families, so we decided we didn't need to have kids ourselves. We loved children, but we weren't interested in the responsibility of raising them. Plus, we enjoyed our freedom to travel and relax with some drinks. We liked seeing families with children, but it wasn't something we wanted for ourselves. When Greta announced her pregnancy, Magnus' attitude towards me started to change. He quit smoking because Greta said she couldn't stand the smell. He even offered to drive her to her doctor's appointments using his vacation days. I warned him that Oscar might get upset if he kept spending so much time with Greta, but Magnus argued back, saying, "You have work, don't you? She's our childhood friend, and she needs help. You're being heartless." I had been buying things and helping where I could, but I thought going with her to the doctor was crossing a line. When I said that, Magnus frowned and glared at me. He snapped, "Why?" "Because Greta wants it. She says she's anxious about the checkup. I can't just let her go alone if she's anxious." I replied, "That's exactly why Oscar should be the one going with her. If you go with her every time, it almost seems like you're the father of her baby." Magnus got defensive and said, "Jealous? You're not going to get pregnant anyway, so what's the problem?" He didn't take my concerns seriously and instead started getting annoyed with me. We had hardly ever fought during our marriage, but things changed once Greta got pregnant. Our arguments became more frequent, and things didn't improve even after Greta gave birth. In fact, Magnus started spending even more time with Greta and their child, Ellen. When Ellen was 6 years old, something happened that changed everything. It all started with her graduation ceremony. The day before the graduation, Magnus suddenly started rummaging through the closet, pulling out clothes in a rush. "Magnus, what are you doing?" Don't you have a meeting tomorrow? I asked, puzzled. Magnus' workplace usually had a casual dress code, but whenever he had a client meeting, he would always wear a suit. So he kept a few suits ready just for those occasions. But now, they were all thrown on the bed in a mess. No. I'm just trying to decide what to wear for the graduation ceremony, he replied. I was shocked. What? You're seriously thinking of attending Ellen's graduation? Yeah, Oscar can't make it, so Greta asked me to go instead, Magnus said casually. That's ridiculous. I couldn't help but raise my voice. Magnus' face turned sour immediately. I knew that he occasionally picked Ellen up from kindergarten, and I had done so myself when Greta asked. But it made no sense for a childhood friend who wasn't even Ellen's parent to attend her graduation ceremony. What? You still don't trust me and Greta? I'm disappointed that you can't even help out, Magnus snapped. That's not the point, I said, trying to explain. But Magnus wasn't interested in listening. Anyway, I'm going to the graduation tomorrow. So make sure you iron a shirt properly, he said, ending the conversation abruptly and heading to the bedroom, leaving me standing there in disbelief. I felt I had no choice but to call Greta. Hello, Greta, about tomorrow. Sorry about tomorrow, but I'm borrowing Magnus, Greta interrupted. But won't Oscar be upset if Magnus attends the graduation instead of him? I asked, worried. Freya, what are you talking about? Of course, I haven't told Oscar that the graduation is tomorrow. I'll tell him after the ceremony, Greta said, sounding unconcerned. I was shocked. How could Oscar not know about his own daughter's graduation? After asking more questions, I found out that Greta hadn't informed Oscar about any of Ellen's kindergarten events, and Magnus had been acting as if he were Ellen's father at school. The realization made me feel dizzy with anger. Wait a minute, Greta. Isn't that extremely unreasonable? It's disrespectful to Oscar. Just because Magnus is your childhood friend doesn't mean this is okay, I said, my voice trembling with frustration. What's wrong, Freya? You sound scary. Anyway, see you tomorrow, Greta replied, and then she hung up the phone without waiting for my response. I was left trembling with anger at how Greta had dismissed my concerns so easily. But in the end, I still ironed a shirt, prepared a tie, and saw Magnus off to Ellen's graduation ceremony the next morning. After that, Magnus and Greta started spending more and more time together. At first, they would go out once a month, then it became once a week, and eventually, it was 3 times a week. Even Oscar began to have suspicions, and one day, while Magnus and Greta were out, he came to our house alone. I'm sorry for coming over so late, but there's something that's been bothering me, Oscar said, looking troubled. Is it about the 2 of them? I asked, already guessing what he was going to say. Yes, Oscar nodded. I want you to take a look at this. He handed me a GPS history from Greta's car. It showed that she had been staying at a hotel 3 times a week, on the same days she was out with Magnus. Just by looking at Oscar's face, I understood what that meant. What do you want to do, Oscar? I asked, knowing that we both felt the same betrayal. I want to take revenge on those 2, Oscar said firmly. Me too, I agreed. I can't forgive them for betraying us like this. So we started planning our revenge in secret. First, I focused on increasing my income because, after doing housework and taking care of Ellen, my income had significantly decreased. Oscar began working from home, and whenever Magnus and Greta went out, Oscar would bring Ellen to my house, and we would take care of her together. Neither Greta nor Magnus had any idea that we knew about their relationship, and we were able to gather solid evidence against them. Once we had enough evidence and were ready to take our revenge, we discovered a shocking truth about Ellen. Oscar and I were torn about what to do next, but we both agreed that we didn't want to hurt young Ellen. So, We decided to wait until she was an adult before going through with our plan. However, just as we decided to endure for the next 10 years, I was diagnosed with a serious illness. I needed long-term hospitalization, and even in the best-case scenario, I wouldn't be discharged for at least 2 years. After my diagnosis, I was able to work from my hospital room, but I knew I would have to reduce my workload. I informed Oscar about my situation and then decided to talk to Magnus. However, Magnus' reaction was cold and indifferent, as if we were just chatting about the weather. "I'll visit you once in a while," he said, without even asking about my condition or the name of my illness. It became clear that Magnus no longer had any affection for me. In reality, Magnus visited me only once a month or sometimes once every 2 months. Things took a strange turn after Ellen's 17th birthday. Before, she used to visit me almost every day, but after turning 17, she suddenly became distant. Oscar and I couldn't figure out why, and even when we asked Ellen, she just brushed it off, saying, "Don't worry about it." The reason finally came to light when Magnus, who rarely showed up, suddenly appeared one day. "Hey, it's been a while," Magnus said, walking in without even knocking. He looked completely different, with a flashy appearance that I barely recognized. After not seeing him for a month, he simply thrust a divorce lawyer's business card at me without any concern for my well-being. "Divorcing a wife who doesn't work. Pay me $2,000 a month as alimony. That's the deal, so take care," Magnus said, grinning from ear to ear. Standing beside him, Greta wrapped her arms around Magnus with a similar smug expression on her face. "Fine, let's divorce then," I replied casually, which seemed to surprise Magnus for a moment. But he quickly exchanged smiles with Greta. It was clear that Magnus wasn't the type to think too deeply, which made my plan easier to execute. After receiving the notice that our divorce was finalized, I decided it was time to start my revenge against the two of them. I was determined to make them cry as a way to celebrate my recovery. I immediately took action. First, I contacted Oscar to arrange a transfer to a new hospital. Then, I informed my lawyer that they would be handling all communications between Magnus and me from now on. At the same time, Oscar started taking steps of his own. He moved to a place near my new hospital with Ellen, and he began visiting me frequently. Although Ellen still had a gloomy expression, I was happy that she came to see me every day. Most of my belongings were already in my hospital room, so I told Magnus to dispose of the rest. I didn't want to bring anything that the two of them might have touched into my new life. Once the hospital transfer was complete and Oscar and Ellen had settled into their new home, I received a call from Magnus. I had only stepped away from my phone for a few minutes, but when I returned, I saw that I had 30 missed calls. Feeling exasperated, I answered the phone. "What the hell is going on?" Magnus shouted, clearly panicked. I could hear the voice of a real estate agent in the background, sounding just as troubled. Greta was yelling too, which made me feel sick. "What do you mean, what's going on?" I asked calmly. "It's about the house. Why do we have to move out?" Magnus yelled, as if it wasn't his fault at all. "Obviously, because that's my house," I replied coolly. Magnus seemed to have completely forgotten, but the truth was, the house we lived in was a space I had rented as my workspace when I first started freelancing. Back then, I didn't have enough income to maintain 2 homes, and Magnus didn't have enough money to live on his own, so he moved into my place. Magnus had never paid rent or utility bills for that room. Although he contributed some money for living expenses, it wasn't enough to maintain the place. Unfortunately for Magnus, that room had already been canceled. The new hospital I transferred to was far away, so I processed the cancellation the day after submitting the divorce papers. I didn't inform Magnus about the house situation because I trusted the real estate agent to handle it. They knew the details and said they would contact him directly. As a result, Magnus was left completely in the dark when Oscar, Ellen, and I suddenly moved and the house was sold. Magnus called me in a panic, shouting, "What are we going to do about our new house?" I casually suggested, I don't know. Maybe stay in a business hotel for now. I could hear the frustration in Magnus' voice as he yelled, "Don't screw with me." However, he quickly changed his tone, trying to sound more soothing. "Well, whatever. When will you transfer the money? We're running low on cash." His sudden demand caught me off guard. "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. "Huh? Don't mess around. I told you to pay $22,000, didn't I?" he snapped. "Oh, I don't recall agreeing to that," I responded nonchalantly. This sent Magnus into a fit of incoherent screaming on the other end of the phone. It was clear that he had been squandering money, assuming he could just get more from me whenever he needed it. Even if he had $22,000 left, how did he expect to get by for the rest of the month? "Hey, don't just stay silent. Say something," Magnus yelled, growing increasingly frustrated. But I was done with his demands. "There's really nothing to talk about," I said, my calmness leaving Magnus momentarily dumbfounded. But he quickly resumed his yelling, now more annoyed than ever. Trying to keep my tone as cheerful as possible, I said, "Anyway, we're basically strangers now, so please don't contact me anymore. You'll hear from my lawyer." "Huh? Lawyer? Hey, wait a minute." Magnus tried to stop me, but I hung up the phone without listening to his response. He tried calling back several times, but I ignored his calls. Eventually, the calls stopped, but Magnus, angry that I wouldn't answer, began ignoring calls from my lawyer too. It was childish, but I never imagined he would become the type of person who didn't mind causing trouble for others. I sighed deeply, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration at Magnus' selfishness. A few months later, after being temporarily discharged from the hospital, I decided to visit Magnus' parents' house. When I arrived, I found Magnus and Greta there, both looking small and trembling. "Telling my parents is a low blow," Magnus said, glaring at me. "Oh, I just reported that we got divorced," I replied calmly. Magnus' father gave him a stern gaze, and Magnus, who had been glaring at me, shrank back under his father's disapproving look. Despite everything, I had always had a great relationship with my in-laws. I even visited and dined with them when Magnus wasn't around. Because they had treated me so well, I felt it was wrong not to share the details of our divorce, so I decided to visit them in person. Magnus' father was the first to speak up. "Is it true that you're remarrying Greta?" he asked, his voice filled with disappointment. "Yes, it's true," Magnus replied, trying to sound confident. "Greta, Ellen, and I are going to start over as a family." "What are you talking about?" Magnus' father shot back. "Your only family is Freya." "She's not my family anymore," Magnus said, his words making his father frown deeply. It was clear that Magnus' father was struggling to understand how things had come to this. Magnus, looking uncomfortable, handed me a piece of paper. It was a bill from a nearby luxury hotel. "What's this?" I asked, confused. "It's the bill from the hotel we stayed at," Magnus said, acting as if it was obvious. Then, suddenly, he collapsed in a heap on the floor. "Oh, what the heck?" he cried out in frustration. His mother, gasping for breath, looked at him in disbelief. "I didn't raise you to be like this," she said, her voice trembling with disappointment. Next to him, Greta wore the same expression, clearly stunned by Magnus' behavior. "Why are you so angry?" Magnus asked his mother, completely clueless. "It's just that the family is changing because I'm getting married. Plus, you'll have a grandchild, a blood-related one at that. Aren't you happy?" Magnus' mother looked at him, clearly struggling to believe what she was hearing. She turned to me, her eyes full of confusion and hurt. Both of my in-laws had always treated me as their own daughter, even though they knew I didn't want children. They treated Greta well too, but there was always a clear boundary between a daughter-in-law and a friend. Greta often complained about this, so I knew my mother-in-law wouldn't be happy about this situation. And Greta should have known it too. You do want Ellen, right? She'll be your grandchild, so you'll be happy, right? Greta asked, still not grasping the gravity of the situation. It's because she's a child I've known since she was little. Oh, but half of her blood is from Magnus, right? Even after everything, Greta showed no sign of remorse. Her inability to understand why everyone was upset gave me goosebumps. At that moment, someone who had been silent until now finally spoke up. Enough already. It's disgusting, Ellen said, her voice cutting through the tense silence in the room. She had been quietly playing with her smartphone in the corner, but now she spoke to Greta without even looking up. The room fell into a stunned silence as everyone tried to process what had just happened. I consider my father my true parent, whether we're related by blood or not. He's the only one that matters to me. You know, Magnus has always been the one attending your school events. I heard everything from Dad, how he was always informed of the event dates after they were over, and how, eventually, even the events themselves were kept from him. But Dad always said I was his daughter, so I am his daughter, and I will never be yours. Ellen glared at Greta as she said this. Then, sitting beside me, she switched to a more concerned tone. You know, when I found out about all this, I thought you would hate me. But Dad said that wasn't the case, so I came here today. Ellen, I love you so much. You were so kind to visit me every day while I was in the hospital. I was really happy, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. Perhaps relieved of her anxiety, Ellen teared up and hugged me tightly. Even though she might be the child resulting from an affair between Magnus and Greta, I've taken care of her for 17 years. There's no way I don't have affection for her. Speaking of which, Greta, weren't you curious why I wasn't surprised when I found out Ellen is Magnus' daughter? I asked, catching Greta off guard. She looked startled, but before she could speak, a new person entered the room. We knew from the start, 12 years ago, actually, Oscar said, suddenly appearing in the doorway. He looked understandably weary, as Greta had recently demanded a divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. I was shocked when you mentioned divorce, Oscar continued. Oh, and unfortunately, you're not divorced yet. The papers are still here. Didn't you notice? Oscar's words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Greta and Magnus' nature to avoid confirming things had come back to haunt them, and it was clear that Greta, despite the 100-day waiting period for women to remarry, hadn't noticed for months. So, Greta is still my wife, and Ellen is still my daughter, Oscar declared, his voice calm but firm. Well, at least for now. Though I suspect there won't be a wife much longer. Wait, what do you mean? A 17-year-old can't choose their parent. That's not true. Ellen wants to be with me, right? Greta's voice was shrill with panic as she turned to Ellen, seeking validation. Ellen frowned at Greta and held my hand instead, making her choice clear. Greta was left speechless, her world crumbling around her, as Magnus suddenly burst into laughter. So that's what it is. You two are together, huh? But too bad. It's impossible to live on Oscar's salary alone. Magnus sneered, trying to regain some control of the situation. Can you stop making weird assumptions? I shot back. And for your information, Oscar earns double what you think. Greta knows about it. Huh? It's probably a bluff, Magnus replied dismissively. Besides, it's impossible for you to work while dealing with your illness. You'll just die miserably somewhere. This time, I laughed, amused by Magnus' huge misunderstanding. Magnus, seeing my laughter, grew frustrated. You didn't know about my income, did you? I asked, still smiling. Huh? It's probably just a bit more than a part-time job, Magnus replied, his confidence wavering. No, it's different. My annual income is $1 million, I said, watching Magnus' eyes and mouth widen in shock. Greta was also stunned. In fact, over the past 12 years, I've become a popular children's book author, and my income had skyrocketed from essays, interviews, and the like. Moreover, a film adaptation is planned soon, so my income is only going up from here. Liar! Magnus exclaimed, refusing to believe me. Oh, do you want to see this? I said, showing Greta my bank account screen. It clearly showed a large amount of money being deposited every month. Greta was at a loss for words when she saw it. Freya, let's, make up, Magnus stammered, suddenly desperate, blinded by the thought of money. What are you saying? Greta snapped, furious at Magnus' words. Blinded by greed, Magnus was trying to worm his way back into my life, but I watched them blankly and then opened my mouth. Well, if you want to get married, feel free. Oh, and I'll definitely be taking the compensation for damages. I turned to leave, ignoring Magnus' protests. Taking Ellen's hand, I said goodbye to my in-laws and walked out of their house. Magnus, who originally worked at my father-in-law's company, was soon exposed for lying about his sales activities and was fired. My father-in-law, determined to teach him a lesson, planned to forcibly put him on a friend's fishing boat and work him to the bone. Working on a fishing boat was tough for someone who loved the indoors like Magnus. He contacted me several times in desperation, but each time I notified my father-in-law, and eventually the calls stopped. Greta lost custody of Ellen to Oscar and got divorced. She seemed uninterested in Magnus, who could no longer afford luxuries, and didn't chase after him. Disowned by her family, she lived alone in a rundown apartment. She hadn't worked at all since getting married, and since she had always made others do things for her, she struggled to adapt. With no skills and few prospects, she worked multiple part-time jobs, barely making ends meet. As for Ellen, she worked hard every day in high school, determined to study abroad and attend a prestigious university overseas. Originally a diligent student, her dream now is to translate my picture books and deliver them to children all over the world, which makes me incredibly happy. And as for me, my picture books are selling well, and I'm receiving more and more offers for animated adaptations and merchandise. My illness is also progressing well, and although I am still hospitalized, my doctor recently told me that I might be able to leave the hospital next year. There's one more thing. Oscar and Ellen come to visit me every day. Actually, Oscar recently confessed to me, with remarriage in mind. I haven't given him my answer yet, but I can't help but have feelings for him. He said he wants us to live together when I leave the hospital. While thinking about what to answer, I work on my picture books every day, hoping for a happy future for us. I weave stories again today, dreaming of a better tomorrow.